I'm going to be done with King James Onlyism on December 31st on this channel. A question I've long had to deal with is becoming more acute. Which responses to me do I respond to? Sometimes in debate, you respond because your opponent is influential. That's why I responded to Brandon Peterson of the Truth is Christ channel, and that's why I responded to R.B. Willett and his book, A More Sure Word, Which Bible Can You Trust? But I don't have time to respond to everyone, especially now. I tend to prefer to respond to people who provide what I call actual engagement, people who really seem to listen and who come up with cogent responses that I did not anticipate. In my video proclaiming that I'll be done with King James Onlyism on the last day of the year, I said that I've hardly gotten any actual engagement. I've gotten only a smattering. Right after I finished the video, I saw that I'd gotten another smatter from none other than Christopher Yetzer, whom I've called my best opponent. Christopher has now done something that no one else has done, to my knowledge, something that is probably the very first step to any serious engagement with my work. He has looked up all the examples of false friends, or basically all, that I've put forward, and he has made some effort to categorize them and even to accept some of them. I respect this greatly. I blocked Christopher from commenting on my channel years ago because I felt we had reached several frustrating impasses, and because I felt that Nehemiah would have been unwise to go back and forth with Sanballat and Tobiah. Just conversing with them meant that Nehemiah was turning from his God-given work. Nonetheless, humility demands that Sanballat might have a point to make every once in a while. Let's see if he did. Christopher Yetzer wrote an article, maybe on Facebook, I don't know, that ultimately appeared on the blogs of Dr. Peter Van Cleek Jr. and his father, Peter Van Cleek Sr. The Van Cleeks are most closely associated right now with confessional bibliology. Again, at this point, not necessarily IFB King James Onlyism like Christopher, who went to Hyles-Anderson College. The Van Cleeks were both at Dr. Jeffrey Riddle's Septuagint conference in August, for example. But as I've had occasion to point out, the border between confessional bibliology and mainstream IFB King James Onlyism is rather poorly guarded, with people going back and forth without having to show their passports. And that makes sense because the arguments of the two groups are almost exactly the same. And in me, they have found a common enemy, therefore. Both groups, with some definite individual exceptions, have steadfastly refused to give me a millimeter when it comes to archaic words in the King James. They see, I think, that admitting publicly to lay people that the King James contains many, many words people don't know they don't know because of language change is fatal to their cause. In fact, it was confessional bibliology's failure to give me a millimeter that first made me wonder if they were really as different from King James Onlyism as they all insisted that they were. But in Yetzer's post, he doesn't just give a millimeter, he gives 5,280 of them, which, if you do the math, is 1/14 of a hectare, and I'll take it. He also makes some advances and counter-arguments against me. I'm going to have to give him a few millimeters. I want to go through the key parts of his post, the parts where he engages with numbers of my false friends. Yetzer titles his post, I am weary of all Mark Ward's posts. And considering that I'm about to quit this debate, I have to agree. I am too, Christopher. Finally, you and I can agree on something. Yetzer then starts his piece with the obvious, as he puts it. He says, there are difficulties in the King James Version, just as there are in every Bible. To say that the language of the King James never causes difficulties to anyone would be to put your head in the sand. And I hate to stop Sanballat before he gets to sentence 4, but I'm already in deep disagreement with the framing. I, of course, agree, strictly speaking, with everything Christopher says here, but it's a change of subject from the one that I've introduced. I've not just talked about difficulties in the King James. I've talked about very specific sets of difficulties. One in particular. Yetzer says there are difficulties in any Bible. He's right. But there aren't difficulties of the kind I talk about. There aren't false friends in modern Bibles. Or rather, there are very few. I have acknowledged that there are a few false friends left over from the King James here and there, especially in the New King James and Modern English Version. And Yetzer will show in a minute that there are more that I haven't seen. But saying, yes, the King James has difficulties, but so do all Bibles, is like saying, yes, the USSR had gulags, but all countries have prisons. That's not just an apples to oranges comparison, it's an apples to truckloads of oranges comparison. Speaking of weariness, I'm just not going to respond to Yetzer's criticisms of my King James Bible study project. By all means, I invite Christopher to do his own King James readability poll, make it bigger, make it more representative, do whatever he thinks he should to make it fair, and present the results to the public. I'm really just interested in how he responds to my main case about false friends. And his response can be summed up in his third point. Nothing new, he says. One of Mark Ward's arguments is that the KJV is now too archaic, and that he has done more than anyone else to help the King James world. I honestly do not believe the King James Version is any more archaic today than it was in the late 1800s. We'll get to a more substantive argument from Christopher in a moment, but let's stop and register this. How does this help his case? To me, it's acknowledging that we're way past the point where something should have been done to, revise or replace the King James, especially in institutional settings. Of course, something was done. The majority of the English-speaking Christian world has agreed with Ben Franklin in the 1770s and with Noah Webster in the 1830s, at least implicitly agreed, that the English of the King James contains enough archaisms that a revision is called for. Merely by buying modern Bibles, they're making this point. The fact that we already reached that point of sufficient unintelligibility by the late 1800s, maybe a century and a half ago, only makes my case stronger, not weaker. But here's where Christopher is strong. Listen to what he says next. And yet, even a century afterwards, it was an effective tool, the King James was, in the lives of so many of our modern scholars and preachers. Now, I think that's true. I think that's an important and weighty point against my viewpoint. It's why I'm not freaking out completely. We're not to Latin Vulgate levels of unintelligibility yet. The King James Version can still absolutely be used by God as an effective tool in the lives of many people, even plowboys. It was an effective tool for me in my childhood. And with a tool as important as the Bible, you don't take it to the tool sharpener every year. You wait till it's sufficiently nicked up and dulled. With a tool as important as the Bible, you also can't wait forever to sharpen it. You need to take it in at some point and get it filed and honed. I think we're there. I think language change has brought us there. I haven't really opined on when we got there. I didn't say it was recent. I didn't say it was just now. I tend to think we were there by the time of Noah Webster in the 1830s because he was our top dictionary man, and he made his own revision of the King James for the very same reasons that I'm calling for revision. Archaic and obsolete words and senses. Words you don't know, and words you don't know. Dead words and false friends. Yetzer quotes a book from 1850, which makes the argument that I've heard from many King James Onlyists, from R.B. Willett, from Dan Hafley, from countless YouTube commenters. The King James, they say, sets the standard in English and for English, and we shouldn't fall away from it. But this book that Christopher quotes also mixes that argument with granting the very simple point that I'm making, namely that the reason normal people can't understand the King James as well as they did in 1611 is that English has changed. Yetzer says, in 1850, J. Jameson published a little book called A Glossary to the Obsolete and Unusual Words and Phrases of the Holy Scriptures in the Authorized English Version. In the preface, Jameson says, and here he'll quote Jameson at length, and I'll read it, "The object of this compilation is, in the first instance, to inform the young and ignorant as to the meaning of some good old words and expressions in the English Bible with which they may be unacquainted, and which will not be found in the common dictionaries, as well as to point out those among them which have disappeared, or are gradually disappearing, however undeservedly, from general use. But it may not be without advantage also to the better informed in bringing to their notice the energy, dignity, and emphatic meaning of many words and phrases of our own tongue, which are unhappily almost banished from the language of the educated classes, though in some cases retained by the common people." This, to me, is all rather confused. Jameson grants that there are obsolete words in the King James. He even grants that those words may not be found in common dictionaries, and that would be then contemporary dictionaries, because presumably the job of those dictionaries was to describe English as it was then spoken and written. Even in 1850, it wasn't possible to assume that you could send King James readers to the dictionary and expect them to come away with proper understanding of a given English word. That's not the dictionary's job, and the OED did not exist back in 1850. But J. Jameson also mixes into his comments some value judgments about language change that I find to be impossible to square with what I actually see in King James English. I don't know J. Jameson. I'm judging only by what he says here and what else I've read in that little book of his. I don't know his full opinions, and I won't give him a label. I'll say that these, however, are exactly the sentiments that plenty of King James Onlyists use today, as indeed Christopher is using them now. But this kind of talk assumes that contemporary English can't really and truly get God's word across to us, and that the older English of the King James is what we really need to get the full power of God's word. Skimming Jameson's book a little, I didn't see any place at all where he felt that contemporary English has greater energy, dignity, or emphatic meaning than Elizabethan English. I've dug into the details, and I still insist that besom has no more energy than broom. Coasts has no more dignity than borders, and study now carries the wrong emphatic meaning compared to be diligent. J. Jameson is offering a false promise, and he's creating false guilt. One comes away thinking that one really ought to read the King James, even if it's harder, because otherwise one will miss the good stuff. That simply is not true. The reverse is true. You'll miss the good stuff if you refuse to read the Bible in your own English and insist on reading it exclusively in someone else's. Yetzer continues to quote Jameson, who says, "It may be a point, therefore, for consideration by our public speakers and writers, whether it would not be well to revive the greater part of such of the good old words which have fallen into disuse, as are to be found in that version, and which, in all their force and beauty, have no equals among those which have so wrongfully taken their places." There he goes again with the guilt. Is it morally wrong for cattle or the herd to have replaced beeves? Is it morally wrong that we say, "They shall fine him" now, instead of "they shall amerce him"? Is reported an ugly word compared to the King James's noised? If anything, I'd say it's the opposite. Jameson's words sound grand and wonderful when they remain high up amidst the far-off, glittering generalities in the heavens, but they crash to earth like a meteor, and not one of the pretty ones that makes a multicolored trail, but one of those bad meteors from aliens who put germs in it, when you actually look at real instances of King James archaisms, which Christopher is, I promise, about to do. Christopher tells us his plan. "I took the about 100 words from Word's site," he means a website where I've started to collect King James false friends, I'll make that public later, "and tried to see what might be new or valuable from his work, what he might have added to the discussion. I believe I was as charitable as possible by using sources he recommends. As a word was eliminated, I no longer checked for further information concerning it. I also used the verses that he recommends on the site, except for maybe in the case of one or two where the site did not list all the verses, and he's right about that." Okay, fair enough. Let's get to the analysis. Christopher says, Category A, I first eliminated anything found in Jameson's 1850 dictionary. These words have been difficult for some people for probably almost 2 centuries. Halt, apt, emulations, meet, careful, spoil, incontinent, judgment, honest, overcharge, prevent, let, conversation, compass, fair, quick, watchings, by and by, bowels, ghost, fray, quit, host, sodden, by myself, flowers, offend, entreat, occupy, wealth, road, press, constantly, lewd, outlandish, people, discover, desire, staggered, heady, pitiful, swelling, approved. As I read all this, I thought once again, and this helps Christopher's case how? Look at Jameson's entry on halt, for example. There it is, limp. The meaning hesitate is a metaphorical extension. Hesitating is like limping. It's an awkward, faltering progress. Here's apt in Jameson's dictionary. I've taken some real grief over apt. KJV-Onlyists have insisted that I'm totally making up any problem related to it, that I'm an ignoramus who hain't read no literature. And yet here's Jameson in 1850 saying exactly what I've said. Apt is now obsolete in the sense used often in the King James, he says. It is now used to express inclined or disposed to. Right, precisely what I said and authorized the use and misuse of the King James Bible. Jameson's odd linguistic views, however, make his assessment of another of my false friends very interesting. Let's take a look. Jameson acknowledges that by and by in the King James meant quickly or immediately in 1611. But he says this expression, like the word presently, has gradually lost its right meaning and gained that of shortly, soon, in a little time. For one thing, I'd say the word has progressed further down the meandering road of language change since 1850. It now means after a while, maybe a good while. For another, what does Jameson mean by lost its right meaning? What is the right meaning of a word or phrase? Is it the meaning it had when it was born? Is it the meaning it had when the speaker was young? Is it the meaning it had when some great literature in a given language was written, like the King James? No matter Jameson's answer, he's guilty of the etymological fallacy. Words simply do not always mean what they used to mean. I have another video about this on my channel. Words change in spelling, pronunciation, and meaning. This is Jameson betraying a fundamental misapprehension of how language works. And this is Yetzer, to some degree, actually granting my point about a full 43 false friends. In fact, not only is he granting my point, he's strengthening it. He's acknowledging that for at least these 43 false friends, English readers have been misunderstanding them, without knowing it, because of language change since at least 1850, which many technologists believe happened before the internet was even invented. This is a point I already made by appealing to lexicographer Noah Webster in previous videos. And now my best opponent is making it for me using a resource I admit I didn't know existed. This is actually one of Christopher's great strengths. It really is, finding cool and interesting stuff at Google Books and the Internet Archive. I wish he would use his strengths only for good. think back to Christopher's framing. He acknowledges that these 43 false friends are difficult for some people. For some, really most, however, I'd actually say not difficult, but impossible without help for pretty much all readers. But why are they difficult? Because English has slowly changed, and though we still use these words, we use them to mean something different than did the Elizabethans. Words don't have forever meanings or proper meanings. They have current meanings that people know, and past meanings, if they've been around a while, that people almost never know. One of the most influential sentences I have ever read about language came from the brilliant and godly Moises Silva. We must accept the obvious fact that the speakers of a language simply know next to nothing about its development. More than likely, even a knowledge of that development is not bound to affect the speaker's daily conversation. The English professor who knows that nice comes from Latin, nacius, ignorant, does not for that reason refrain from using the term in a complimentary way. This is why Bible translations need to be revised. People don't know what they don't know about the history of their own words. Even the people who insist that language should not change end up using current English to say so, every time. Christopher now moves on from Jameson to bring up other categories of King James false friends. If I'm following him correctly, he's acknowledging that these further false friends were not found in Jameson's book. I checked a few of them, and that does seem to be the case. It's a little complicated, as we'll see, but he's at least sort of acknowledging an additional 40 or so false friends that either weren't false friends in 1850 or were not noticed by Jameson. One thing I've pled with King James-Onlyist to do is to categorize readability difficulties in Bibles, English ones. They seem always content to point to 5 or 10 max difficult or obscure words in the NIV and then proclaim that the debate is over because I'm inconsistent. Why am I complaining about King James words and not about NIV words? And I'm always saying, yes, but categorize. Are there archaic words in the NIV that could easily be revised using accurate words the plowboy of today already knows? Christopher has heard this call. I'm excited. He's about to categorize King James archaisms. The first category, consisting of 2 false friends, are words that Christopher says are still common in British English, corn and want. And I want to know, so can Americans have a King James revision that changes corn to grain and want to lack, so we're no longer confused? Would that be wrong? I don't see how this helps Christopher's case, except in Britain, with these 2 words. And Britain, historians agree, existed before 1850, but is a lot smaller than the U.S. and has far fewer Bible-reading Christians. Marginal notes will help, but they won't solve this problem. Next category, and here we get to what I would call the second real substance of Christopher's post, and maybe the first real advance. I think Christopher is onto something. Look, he categorizes some of my false friends as merely literal translations. Category C, literal translation, fell on his neck, which appears in the ESV, he says, taxed, and you. With fell on his neck, Christopher has scored a point. This is one genuine possible answer to at least this false friend. What Christopher is saying, I believe, is that fell on his neck was difficult even in 1611 because it's accurate, because it's literally what the Hebrew and Greek say in the 3 places where this phrase appears in the King James. And he's right about that. Now, he's saying it's not an idiom in English, or wasn't. And that raises 2 questions. Was this phrase non-idiomatic in 1611 English? In other words, did the plowboy understand it at that time? I confess my tools fail me. Phrases are hit or miss in the OED. I do not know the answer to this question. It's more than possible that the plowboy in 1611 did not know this phrase. So let me give this 10th part of a leader to Christopher. But this only raises my second question. Are we truly required to translate idioms literally in order to call our translations accurate? The King James translators did often give literal translations of idioms, such as the skin of one's teeth. But it didn't always. God forbid and God save the king are 2 examples. More literally, they would be, may it never be, and long live the king. Fell on his neck isn't actually on my list, one of King James' false friends. Maybe it was just a literal translation. I would be willing to concede this point, especially if Christopher could show that the phrase was not in use outside Bible translations in the English of 1611. But this only gets us back to 0, after which we can ask, wouldn't it be okay to translate this phrase with the word or phrase today's plowboy would understand, like he hugged him or he embraced him? I'll skip over taxed. I granted in the video where I discussed that word that it's difficult to pin down. I think I was right, but Christopher could be right instead. It's true. But you most certainly does not belong in this category of literal translation. I know what Christopher is trying to say, but I've done extensive work on this in my King James Bible Study Project video that no King James Onlyists, including Christopher, have engaged in any detail, other than to object to the study being done in a way they wouldn't have done it. And unless Christopher can do that engagement work before December 31st, 2024, I'm probably not going to get a chance to evaluate his response. In the next category, Christopher offers a simple negation. One or two of these he has denied to be false friends before. He says these words have not suffered a semantic shift. He lists commend, miserable, that, corrupt, moisture, enlargement, in, imagine, and condemn. And I say, yes, they have too. They have too suffered semantic shifts. And I'm not really trying playground tactics here. I don't blame Christopher for not going into detail. He's done so elsewhere with miserable, at least, and I've answered him. As I used to say at the end of public discussions with him, I'm content for people to read what he says, read what I say, and come to their own conclusion. I still think that commend, miserable, corrupt, enlargement, imagine, and condemn are all false friends. I'm honestly not sure what he's referring to with that and in. I just forget. And with moisture, I've already acknowledged that one's very tricky. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Now we get to another point of substance, an actual reply, a kind of advance in the debate with King James Onlyism. Christopher finds a number of false friends that are still used in modern Bible versions. He actually sat down and did the homework to find these, and I commend him for it. I really do. He is the only King James Onlyist I'm aware of who has done anything like this. This is engagement. Look at his Category E. Category E for Christopher are false friends of mine that are used in modern Bibles which Ward recommends. New King James, Modern English Version, Simplified King James, that's probably the World English Bible, maybe it's Webster's, ESV, Net Bible, and Legacy Standard Bible. Christopher gives these examples. Remove is in the New King James, landmark is in the New King James, heresies is in the MEV, New King James, and Simplified King James, cattle is in the LSB, Net, and NASB, necessities is in the World English Bible, study is in the MEV, counsel is in the MEV, manches is in the New King James, rumor in the MEV, peculiar MEV, followers MEV, bruise MEV, brethren is in these Bibles, passengers is in the MEV, rage is in these Bibles, imaginations in the MEV, issues is in the MEV. This is canny. This scores a few metric points again, which are smaller than imperial points, but nonetheless still count as points under international Scrabble rules. But notice something. It's mainly the MEV that keeps coming up. The MEV is a very light revision of the King James. I'll say it right here. I think it's too light. And that's actually one reason I recommend it to the King James Onlyists who say they're open to a King James revision. It's not a very big jump, but I will admit openly, I think the MEV translators were wrong not to revise these words to contemporary English alternatives, because they are false friends. If you drop the MEV and a few other less common versions that I really don't actively use or recommend, like the World English Bible, you go from a list of 17 examples to a list of 6. And the main offender that's left is the New King James. What can I say? I think the New King James was, like the MEV, mistaken at the points Christopher lists. I think it failed to catch just a few false friends. Though I grant that heresies is a tough one, mansions is not. There's just no way that the New King James translator should have let that through in John 14:2. Christopher has indeed scored a small point. If you are a King James Onlyist and you pick up only the MEV in addition to the King James, you will still miss some false friends. The same goes a tiny bit for the New King James. But these two translations I recommend all the time do catch lots and lots of other false friends, the great majority of them, as far as I know. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you're a King James Onlyist, pick these translations up and see for yourself what you've been missing. Christopher's next category are words that have not changed sense, just intensity. He puts ass and bastard in this category. Now, I gave careful arguments in my video on bad words in the King James for why these should be regarded as false friends. For example, the word donkey didn't even exist in 1611. It wasn't an option for the King James translators. Ass was the word for donkey back then, the only option I'm aware of. Clearly, our situation has changed. And actually, Christopher is granting this. Why should a change in intensity somehow not count as a change in meaning? Intensity is part of meaning. I recently did a video pointing out that Paul condemns debates amidst a list of other sins in several places in his letters. And yet, Christopher is debating me. Is he sinning? No, because the word has lessened in its intensity. In 1611, the word could mean something more like quarrel or contention. Christopher is among the most self-controlled King James only leaders. I don't think he was guilty of contention in this article. There's really only one more thing he says that makes a contribution in advance that counts as engagement. It's category G on his list, false friends of mine, for which he found a definition in the Modern American Heritage Dictionary, which Ward recommends on his first videos as a good source of modern language, and yet are not marked as archaic. He lists variance, convenient, excess, peculiar, moderation, suffer, and wait on. Now, I've acknowledged previously with regard to some words, I do disagree with the American Heritage Dictionary and Merriam-Webster. A couple places. I rarely disagree with the Oxford English Dictionary, however, and even when I do, it's typically in my experience because they fail to mark a sense as obsolete that really ought to be. And typically in my experience, that happens when that particular word hasn't been touched since the 1899 edition of the dictionary. In other words, some King James words have become false friends since 1850, even since 1900. Christopher says of my false friends in his article, most all of those words, at least the ones we agree, are less clear today. He can't bring himself to say that they're words people don't know, that they're misleading. He just calls them difficult or less clear. Anyway, he says they are in the defined KJV. This is one of the great ironies of my work. Every single day for the last 5 years, King James Onlyists have denied or evaded particular King James false friends I put forward. And yet, many of these false friends have been sitting the whole time in the margins of Arch King James Onlyist D.A. Waite's defined King James Bible the whole time. Just look at the comments on my false friends videos. King James defenders insist that I'm wrong in practically every one of them. Before I blocked him, Christopher was often one of them. And here's Christopher acknowledging, along with D.A. Waite, that I'm not wrong. Christopher Yetzer uses Jameson's book to say that contemporary discussion of false friends in the King James hasn't offered anything that was not already known. To borrow IT speak about software bugs, this is Yetzer saying, these are known issues. And I say, known by whom? Not by me, not by any of the many, many King James readers that I know. The fact that someone in 1850 was acknowledging that halt used to mean limp but doesn't anymore, how does that help modern King James readers, effectively all of whom are ignorant of Jameson's book? If I uncover a software bug, I send it to my IT guy and he tells me, oh, we've known about that issue for the last 15 years. That actually makes me more worried about his competence, not less. Yetzer is assuming that there's a discussion about King James words, an ongoing conversation. There may be such a thing among a few red-headed nerds, but that doesn't help the 99.9% of King James users who have no idea this discussion exists, many of whom are not nerds, and some of whom have brown hair or are bald. And I've been paying attention to King James issues for a long time. I've never heard this discussion, not till I started it again. It seems to me that social media has afforded me the opportunity to do what others who tried to make the same case could not do. Noah Webster made this case. The RSV translators made this case in their preface, but they couldn't hammer it home in frivolous video after entertaining and witty video. Christopher goes to the same place all King James Onlyists always do, when, for reasons that God only knows in their hearts, and I don't know, they become willing to acknowledge some of my false friends. He says we just have to teach people to read the archaisms. I believe that we have the responsibility to teach and aid where and when we can, just as Tyndale and others stated. I want to be like Jameson and inform the young and ignorant as to the meaning of some good old words and expressions in the English Bible with which they may be unacquainted. Lord willing, Christopher says, I will be a part of providing something free and complete to edify anyone who has difficulty reading the King James. This is almost fully granting my case. And here's my huge question for King James Onlyism as a whole, and for Christopher in particular. If people actually do need help understanding these King James false friends, why am I your enemy and not your friend? One King James Onlyist who makes very intense and vitriolic 3 or 4 hour response videos to me on a regular basis, his name rhymes with trick players, has actually made his own update of the King James. If I'm so off base about King James archaisms, why was his work necessary? When I argue that a given word in the King James is a false friend, I almost never hear from King James Onlyists. Yes, Mark, you're right. Many people are misunderstanding that word without knowing it. Christopher couldn't bring himself to say that. And I can count on 2 fingers the number of times King James Onlyists have said to me, I did not know that false friend before I watched your video, Mark. Thank you. Why? Why can't they learn from me or admit to learning from me? I have to believe it's because I'm not King James only. They don't want to give me 1/10 of 1% of a nanometer. I get it. So here's my hope. Christopher says that he and some other King James defenders, I think I might know some of them, will be part of providing something free and complete to edify anyone who has difficulty reading the King James, which I will point out is everyone, including me. And I'm not selfish. I will taste no sour grapes. If my King James only brothers and sisters don't trust me and therefore refuse to learn from me, I pray that Christopher and his friends will be successful where I failed. I just want people to understand their Bibles. They don't have to learn these false friends from me. I don't care. Even if the King James is clarified of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my perhaps forever hiatus from King James issues, I therein do rejoice. Dan Hafley and Christopher Yetzer say that we just need to teach people to read the King James. So do it. And God bless you. I give you blanket permission to use my work with no attribution. Take my whole book, King James Words You Don't Know, You Don't Know. Change the name on the title page from Mark Ward to Christopher Yetzer or Dan Hafley or Jeffrey Riddle or whatever name you want that's trusted by King James Onlyists. I will not sue. If you do this, you might want to check with my publisher first, however, and do please take out any illustrations that involve my wife or children. That's all I ask, because that would be weird. All I want is for King James Onlyists to understand what they read in God's Word. Now, a little advice for Christopher Yetzer and his friends doing this project. Many people in the King James only world will hate and despise you. They will say all manner of evil things against you falsely for daring to suggest, like D.A. Wade did, that study actually meant be diligent in 1611. I don't think you'll get a free pass because you're a true King James believer. I really don't. If you need counsel for how to answer these folks, feel free to reach out to me. I'm leaving the job, but I have a lot of experience. Also, very practically, I encourage Christopher to embrace the term false friends, much as Methodists embraced what was for them originally a term coined by their enemies. And here's why. It's already established, and not only by me, and I think it's essential to have a label to distinguish King James words people know they don't know from King James words people don't know they don't know. Otherwise, if you don't have this kind of labeling system, you won't really be able to teach people how to fish for false friends. You'll only be giving them fish. And I think they simply aren't going to be able to remember long fish lists. This is quite possibly my last farewell to my best opponent. I will see you in glory, brother. You are my brother. And there in glory we will love one another more than we love our nearest and dearest now. Remember that, I pray.